The dark Mediterranean night was shattered by the blinding brilliance of searchlights cutting through the gloom. It was March 28, 1941, and the calm waters off the coast of Greece were about to become a graveyard for the Italian Navy. The silence of the sea was replaced by the mechanical hum of turrets rotating and the nervous breath of thousands of sailors waiting for the command to fire. This was not a chance encounter, but a calculated ambush set in motion by intelligence and daring. In the pitch-black darkness, the shapes of massive warships loomed like steel leviathans ready to unleash hell upon an unsuspecting enemy force that believed it was safe. Control over the Mediterranean Sea was the ultimate prize, and the stakes could not have been higher for the British Empire. The supply lines running to North Africa and Greece were the arteries of the Allied war effort against the Axis powers. If the Italian fleet could sever these vital connections, the British forces in Egypt would starve, and the entire Middle East might fall to fascist control. The Royal Navy had to maintain supremacy at all costs, but the threat of the modern and powerful Italian surface fleet was a constant shadow looming over every convoy that dared to cross the open water. Leading the British Mediterranean fleet was a man of iron will and aggressive instincts named Admiral Andrew Cunningham. He was a veteran seaman who believed that the only way to win a naval war was to seek out and destroy the enemy fleet wherever it could be found. Cunningham was known for his sharp tactical mind and his refusal to play it safe when a decisive victory was within reach. He understood that the Italian Regia Marina was cautious but dangerous, and he spent every waking moment plotting a way to lure them into a fight on his own terms. The pressing question haunting the British Admiralty was whether their aging battleships could catch and destroy the faster and more modern Italian vessels. The Italian ships were built for speed and operated close to their home bases with the theoretical protection of land-based air power. Could Cunningham bridge the gap in speed and technology to force a decisive engagement? The answer would depend on a combination of daring leadership and a secret technological advantage that the Italians did not even know existed. The coming days would test the limits of men and machines in a high-speed chase across the sea. To understand the magnitude of this clash, one must look at the ambition of Benito Mussolini and his desire to turn the Mediterranean into an Italian lake. The Italian Navy, or Regia Marina, was the pride of his regime, featuring elegant and heavily armed battleships like the Vittorio Veneto. These ships were faster than their British counterparts and possessed guns that could strike with devastating power. The Italian commanders felt confident that they could dictate the terms of battle, engaging when favorable and retreating with their superior speed if the situation turned against them. However, the British possessed a weapon far more potent than gunpowder or steel plating. Deep within the secret facility at Bletchley Park, code breakers were deciphering the encrypted communications of the Axis powers. This intelligence source, known as Ultra, provided Cunningham with a window into the mind of the Italian High Command. He knew when they were sailing, and he knew their targets. This information stripped away the fog of war, allowing the British admiral to position his slow-moving battleships in exactly the right place to intercept the faster Italian raiders. Armed with this secret foreknowledge, Cunningham devised a trap to lure the Italian fleet into the open waters south of Crete. He knew that if the Italians suspected the British fleet was at sea, they would stay in port. Therefore, he had to orchestrate an elaborate deception to convince enemy spies that the British fleet was resting idly at anchor in Alexandria. Every detail of the ruse had to be perfect, because a single slip would alert the cautious Italian Admiral Angelo Iacchino and ruin the opportunity to strike a crippling blow. To sell the deception, Admiral Cunningham famously walked off his flagship carrying a set of golf clubs in full view of the harbor watchers. He spent the afternoon acting as though he had not a care in the world, intending to play a leisurely round of golf. This performance was designed to lull the Italian agents in Egypt into a false sense of security. As the sun began to set, Cunningham quietly returned to his ship and ordered the fleet to raise steam. The golf clubs were merely a prop in a high-stakes theater of war. Under the cover of darkness, the British fleet slipped out of Alexandria harbor one by one. The mighty battleships Warspite and Bahram, along with the Valiant, moved silently through the breakwater. They were joined by the aircraft carrier Formidable, which would prove to be the linchpin of the operation. The crews were tense knowing that they were sailing into enemy waters to hunt a fleet that outmatched them in speed and modernity. They steamed northwest hoping that the deception had bought them enough time to close the distance. Meanwhile, the Italian fleet under Admiral Angelo Iacchino was already at sea steaming towards the convoy routes near Crete. Iacchino was a competent commander, but he suffered from a critical lack of information compared to his adversary. He believed the British Mediterranean fleet was still in port or two far away to intervene. He was also promised air support from the German Luftwaffe and the Italian Royal Air Force support that would prove woefully inadequate when the fighting actually started. He sailed into the trap blind. On the morning of March 27th, a British reconnaissance plane spotted the Italian fleet. The report confirmed what Ultra had already suggested. The enemy was at sea and heading for the convoy routes. Cunningham ordered his ships to increase speed, pushing the engines of his World War I-era battleships to their limits. The chase was on, but the distance was still great. If the Italians realized the danger too soon, they could simply turn around and use their superior speed to escape back to the safety of their ports. To draw the Italians in, Cunningham deployed a squadron of light cruisers under Vice Admiral Pridham Whipple. These ships were to act as bait, presenting a tempting target for the heavy Italian guns. The plan was for these cruisers to make contact and then retreat, leading the pursuing Italians directly into the jaws of the waiting British battleships. It was a dangerous mission that required the lighter ships to expose themselves to fire from vessels that could blow them out of the water with a single salvo. The bait worked and the Italian cruisers spotted the smaller British force. Admiral Iacchino, seeing an opportunity to crush a weaker detachment, ordered his ships to engage. The British cruisers turned and fled just as planned, but the situation was perilous. The Italian shells began to fall around them, throwing up massive geysers of water. The British ships zigzagged desperately to avoid the incoming fire, praying that the main body of their fleet would arrive in time to save them from destruction. Suddenly, the stakes escalated dramatically as the Italian flagship Vittorio Veneto appeared on the horizon. This modern battleship, armed with 15-inch guns, was a beast of war that the light cruisers could not hope to fight. She opened fire from long range, her massive shells straddling the fleeing British ships. The situation for the bait squadron was now critical. They were being hunted by one of the most powerful ships in the world, and their destruction seemed imminent unless help arrived from the sky. Salvation came in the form of the aircraft carrier Formidable. Cunningham knew that he could not catch the Vittorio Veneto with his battleships alone, so he unleashed his air power. A strike force of Ferry Albacore torpedo bombers launched from the deck of the carrier. These biplanes looked like relics from a bygone era with their double wings and slow speed, but they carried a lethal payload. They buzzed towards the Italian battleship, determined to slow her down. The Italian anti-aircraft gunners filled the sky with smoke and shrapnel as the slow-moving biplanes approached. It seemed impossible that such fragile machines could survive the wall of fire. Yet the British pilots pressed their attack with cold courage, dropping their torpedoes into the water. The Italians maneuvered wildly to avoid the underwater killers. The attack forced the Vittorio Veneto to stop firing at the cruisers and focus on survival, buying the British ships precious time to escape. Admiral Iacchino, realizing that he was operating without the promised air cover and facing carrier-based planes, decided to break off the engagement. He ordered his fleet to turn back towards Italy. The hunter had become the hunted. Cunningham watched the reports with frustration. The Italians were retreating, and despite the air attacks, they were still moving faster than his battleships. If he could not slow them down, the greatest opportunity to destroy the Italian navy would slip through his fingers. The pursuit continued into the afternoon, with the British battleships straining to close the gap. Cunningham knew that he had to damage the Vittorio Veneto before nightfall. Once darkness fell, the Italians might escape, or the British might blunder into a chaotic night battle. He ordered a second wave of aircraft to launch from the Formidable. The pilots knew that everything depended on them. They had to land a torpedo hit on the Italian flagship to cripple her speed. The second airstrike was a chaotic affair of swirling planes and bursting flak. The pilots braved the intense defensive fire and launched their torpedoes. One of the metal fish found its mark, striking the Vittorio Veneto near her stern. The explosion jammed her rudder and caused her to take on thousands of tons of water. The mighty ship slowed to a crawl before her crew could effect temporary repairs. Her speed dropped significantly, allowing the British battleships to creep closer. With the Vittorio Veneto damaged, the Italian fleet was forced to slow down to protect their flagship. Admiral Iacchino formed a defensive ring of cruisers and destroyers around the wounded giant. He was unaware that the main British battle fleet was now only hours behind him. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky turned a blood red, signaling the approach of a night that would see terrible violence. The British were relentless, sensing that their quarry was wounded. In a final attempt to stop the Italians before total darkness, a third airstrike was launched at dusk. In the confusion and fading light, the pilots mistook the heavy cruiser Pola for the battleship. A torpedo slammed into the Pola, bringing her to a dead halt. The machinery spaces flooded and all electrical power was lost. The great cruiser sat helpless in the darkening water, a sitting duck in the middle of the ocean. This event triggered the fatal mistake that would doom the Italian force. Admiral Iacchino, unaware that the British battleships were rapidly approaching, ordered two of his heavy cruisers, the Zara and the Fiume, to turn back and assist the stricken Pola. He believed the British were still far astern and that his ships could tow their sister vessel to safety. It was a decision made in the fog of war based on incomplete information, and it would cost him dearly. The Zara and Fiume, accompanied by 4 destroyers, reversed course and steamed back into the darkness. They were sailing directly towards the muzzles of the British 15-inch guns. The Italian ships were not equipped for night fighting, and their crews were exhausted. They had no radar and were relying on visual lookouts staring into the pitch-black night. They had no idea that they were moving towards an executioner who could see them clearly. The British advantage in radar technology proved to be the deciding factor. On the bridge of the warspite, operators watched the glowing green blips on their screens. They could see the Italian ships moving in the dark, while the Italians remained oblivious. Cunningham ordered his ships to turn their guns towards the contacts. The turrets swung silently in the night, the massive barrels elevating to the correct range calculated by the radar data. The tension on the British bridges was palpable. The range closed rapidly. 10,000 yards, 8,000 yards, 6,000 yards. The British held their fire, waiting until they could not miss. The Italian ships emerged from the gloom as dark silhouettes against the horizon. The officers on the Zara and Fiume were looking for the Pola, completely unaware that the shadows looming nearby were enemy battleships. At a range of only 3,800 yards, point blank for a battleship, Cunningham gave the order to open fire. The darkness was instantly banished by the blinding white light of searchlights snapping on. The beams caught the Italian cruisers in their glare, illuminating every detail. The Italian sailors were frozen in shock, blinking in the sudden brilliance. Before they could even sound the alarm, the British flagship unleashed her fury. The 15-inch guns of the Warspite and Valiant erupted with a thunderous roar that shook the ocean floor. The muzzle flashes were so bright they were seen by ships miles away. 6 tons of armor-piercing steel screamed across the short distance in seconds. The first salvos smashed into the Fiume. The cruiser did not stand a chance. The shells tore through her armor plating and detonated deep inside her hull, turning the ship into a raging inferno. Simultaneously, the battleship Barham poured fire into the Zara. The heavy cruiser was ripped apart by the impacts. Turrets were blown completely off their mountings and flew into the sea. The bridge structure disintegrated under the hammer blows of the heavy shells. Within minutes, 2 of the pride of the Italian Navy were reduced to burning wrecks, drifting helplessly. It was not a battle, it was a massacre executed with cold mechanical precision. The Italian destroyers tried to launch a counterattack, but they were swept aside by the secondary armament of the British battleships. The ocean was lit by the eerie glow of burning oil and exploding magazines. The roar of the guns and the screams of twisting metal filled the air. The Fiume capsized and sank, taking most of her crew with her. The Zara remained afloat for a while longer, a burning torch in the night, before she too was sent to the bottom. The original victim, the crippled cruiser Pola, was still floating nearby, her crew watching in horror as their rescuers were annihilated. The British destroyers moved in on the helpless ship. The captain of the Pola, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, ordered his men to abandon ship. The British sailors boarded the vessel taking prisoners and marveled at the lack of resistance. The fight had been knocked out of the Italians by the sheer violence of the battleship attack. With the enemy force destroyed, Cunningham ordered his ships to pick up survivors. In a display of naval chivalry, the British crews worked to pull hundreds of oil-soaked Italians from the water. They were enemies only minutes ago, but now they were fellow mariners at the mercy of the sea. The rescue operation continued until dawn, revealing the human cost of the engagement. The water was thick with debris and the dead. The arrival of German aircraft the next morning forced the British to abandon the rescue effort. Cunningham sent an open radio signal to the Italian Admiralty, giving the location of the remaining survivors so that a hospital ship could be sent. It was a gesture of humanity in a brutal war. The British fleet turned back towards Alexandria, leaving the scene of their triumph. They had struck a blow that would resonate throughout the naval world. The toll on the Italian Navy was catastrophic. 3 heavy cruisers, the Zara, Fiume, and Pola, along with 2 destroyers, were at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Over 2,300 Italian sailors and officers had lost their lives, including Admiral Cunningham. The battleship Vittorio Veneto, although damaged, had managed to limp back to port, but the psychological damage to the Italian fleet was permanent. In stark contrast, the British losses were incredibly light. They had lost only a single aircraft and its crew. No British ships had been seriously damaged. It was a lopsided victory that vindicated Cunningham's aggressive doctrine and the investment in radar technology. The Royal Navy had proven that it was the master of the night and that it could project power even in waters claimed by the enemy. The strategic impact of the Battle of Cape Matapan was profound. The Italian surface fleet effectively withdrew from the war in the Mediterranean, refusing to venture out in force again. They remained in their harbors, paralyzed by the fear of another night encounter with British battleships. This ceded control of the sea to the Royal Navy, allowing them to move convoys with relative impunity for the next crucial months. With the Italian fleet neutralized, the supply lines to the British forces in North Africa were secure. This allowed the buildup of troops and material that would eventually lead to the defeat of the Africa Corps. The supplies to Malta were also maintained, keeping the island fortress alive as a thorn in the side of the Axis. The victory at Matapan had far-reaching consequences that extended to the sands of the Desert War. Admiral Andrew Cunningham had cemented his legacy as one of the greatest naval commanders in history. He had taken a calculated risk, used deception and intelligence, and struck with overwhelming force. His leadership proved that the spirit of Nelson was alive and well in the modern Royal Navy. The battle demonstrated that technology like radar, when combined with aggressive leadership, could decide the fate of nations. The Battle of Cape Matapan marked the end of an era for the Italian Navy and a turning point in the war for the Mediterranean. It was a night where the old rules of engagement were rewritten by radar and air power. As the sun rose over the empty sea on March 29th, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The Royal Navy stood dominant, and the whisper of time would record this night as the moment the Italian fleet lost its soul.